You got headphones on, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's recording now.
It is?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I see it recording.
All right, so we're just going to chat for a couple minutes and see how this sounds.
Let's record a podcast.
You think we should record the entire podcast?
Well, I mean, you could do something, 20 minutes.
You think so?
Why not? That's what
Todd, I guess, Todd, you're game for that then?
Yeah, I'm fine.
I'm hearing like lots of different stuff going on in the headphones, so I'm not sure.
Take the headphones off.
Take the headphones off?
Yeah, unplug them.
Okay. And then don't worry about what it sounds like on the other end.
Well, I mean, there's only one way to find out if this works.
Yeah, I suppose so. So, all right, Todd, you can hear me. I am going to, we'll do a pretend podcast then, and maybe this will actually, or maybe a real podcast. We'll see.
Sounds good.
Okay. So, Todd, why don't you tell us about yourself? Tell the listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name's Todd Mandel. I run a small consulting firm called Building Mighty Communities. Focuses primarily on grant development services and organizational and management services for nonprofit, primarily for nonprofit organizations in Wisconsin and around the country. I started about a year and a half ago when I left working for a large regional nonprofit that I'd spent about just a little over a decade at, where I oversaw economic development, housing development, homebuyer programs, and it was time for a lifestyle change, and it's been good.
Fantastic. So tell us just a little bit about, obviously with this other entity, you probably were doing quite a bit of grant writing in your role. What's the largest grant that you ever wrote and were awarded?
I think the largest, or at least the most impactful grant, it was a project in a small town where we were approached by the county because the small town had gotten itself over its head. They had they had put in improvements for 60 lots, and they'd done it on a loan from a bank. And the developer that had owned the 60 lots went belly up, and the county ended up taking all of those lots through tax foreclosure. But they couldn't afford to pay the special assessments to pay the town back, and so the town was facing bankruptcy. And so the county approached me and said, is there some way that we can salvage this mess? And we went out and all together put together about $3 or $4 million of workforce housing money to build some single family housing, some rental housing. By the time we were all said and done, we built, I think, 16 units of housing, which is about 8 years of housing supply in that little town.
Yeah, that's really amazing.
Yeah, and what was great about it was, by doing that, we bought the lots from the village or from the county, and that provided enough cash flow because the county then turned around and gave that money to the village, and that provided the village enough cash flow that they could stay solvent for about a 7-year period. And mind you, this was all during the housing crisis, so that was
right.
That was a benefit, right? Extra bonus. And today, if you go there, it's actually really cool. You go there, and all 50 some of the lots have now been developed. It's a great little neighborhood. There's permanently affordable housing there because we use the community land trust model. There's affordable rental housing. There's some really high-end housing. And the town was like 600 people when we started. It's probably 800 people today. So
yeah.
But it's just one of those moments where somebody sits down and says, "Hey, is this possible?" And your first instinct is, "No, it's not." And then you start thinking through and you're like, all right, well, if we get super creative and things break the right way, we can pull this off.
Yeah, which is so cool. That's totally my jam when it comes to projects and other things is creativity and trying to reach and achieve some of the things that groups of people might say are impossible. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. That's the more creative, the better. With the realization that there's some level of creativity that people aren't comfortable funding.
Right. Yeah, that's super great. So why do you think it is, and maybe this is just my own perception of things, but why do you suppose that people, businesses, nonprofit entities tend to be kind of intimidated by grant writing? Or maybe am I totally wrong on that? What's your take on how people feel about grants?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's lots of, we say grants, but there are a lot of different levels of grants. And so I think people usually aren't too terribly intimidated by local grants. So grants that come from, small community foundations, or, the $1,000 grant you get from Walmart by talking to the store manager and then just putting in a simple online, like 5 feet application.
Right.
Where I think people get a little more uh, cautious, or they get a little more risk adverse, is when they start looking at federal grants or even state grants. And it's, I think, largely because those grants tend to have a lot of the nonprofit professional stuff wrapped around them. That's where you start seeing things like they want your federal employer ID number, which isn't really a big deal, but some nonprofits don't even realize they have a federal employee ID number.
Right.
Or they want to register with the General Services Administration, or they want you have to have a DUNS number with the Duns and Bradstreet Corporation. And then it's even silly ancillary things like, they're like, I need a DUNS number. And then, so they Google that. And the first 7 hits they get, I'll tell them they need to spend $300 to get a DUNS number, which is not true.
Right.
It's free. But there's all these scam sites that will charge you hundreds and hundreds of dollars to do something that is literally free and takes 5 minutes.
Right.
And so they look at that and they go, nope. And then on the other side is they have conversations with those funders, and funders aren't, especially on the government side, aren't always super excited about working with smaller nonprofits or smaller businesses that haven't used grants before, because they don't have a lot of wiggle room, unlike a private foundation where it's their money, their rules. And if they want to change the rules, they just change the rules. They have a board to answer to, but that's it. Government funders, state, federal, have authorizing legislation that they have to answer to, and you can't change authorizing legislation. So, and you can't ask for an exception to the authorizing legislation because it's the law. And so, I think that starts to get people a little more leery. And I also think sometimes people just have a hard time imagining what they would do with the money. Like, they have this great idea, and they go, and the funder's like, well, I'm not interested in funding that for $3,000 because that's not worth my time, but I'll give you $15,000 for it. And then people are like, I don't know what I would do with $15,000.
What a problem to have. I would love to have that problem at some point.
There's the old phrase, and there's the phrase in the nonprofit sector that there's bad money. And that's money you get from a funder that comes with so many strings that you can't spend it, or spending it costs you more money than it's worth. There's good money, which is the money you want. And then there's catastrophic money, which is you get more money than you want, but it's so big that it overwhelms your organization and sucks all your organizational capacity out.
Right.
And so with whatever project it is, but you're just exhausted and you can't do anything else. And I have seen nonprofits that just stop existing because they got across the finish line, but now everybody's burned out, spent, done, and they don't move on to the next project because nobody has any energy.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So, one of the reasons I've written some grants in my day, and some successfully and some not so successfully. I think one of the biggest challenges for me has been, and this isn't a very nice thing to admit about myself, but I do have trouble following directions sometimes. And I feel like grants, it's so essential when you're working on a grant that you're following directions and you're really breaking it down one piece at a time. Can you talk about how, for those of us in the business world or the nonprofit world that don't always like to follow directions, can you talk about how grant writers, professional grant writers such as yourself can be of assistance?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so grants are very specific. The grant funder is going to lay out a set of requirements. Some are pretty basic and some can get pretty detailed. And from the funder side, if they're going to give you money, they want you to prove that you can follow a set of steps and instructions. And that's really because once they give you the money, that's just the start of the relationship. It's not the end. And so even if it's just a 1-year grant, your funder and you are tied together for a year.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're going to follow the rules, that you're going to use the money you say you will, and that at the end, you're going to give them, or even throughout the process, you're going to give them the reports they need that they have to prove to whomever the money is being spent appropriately. I've worked with some for-profit businesses where we gave them grants or we gave them really great loans. And the amount of pain and effort of trying to get data out of those businesses was just really challenging. It made it hard for us to want to do that in the future as an organization at that time.
Right.
So, one benefit a professional grant writer can bring is that they have experience. They've seen the requirements are often the same across grants. They can help you okay, this says you have to have a SAM registration. Here's where you go, and here's how you get it. Or just give me information. I can do it for you. Or they can help you with kind of understanding exactly what it is the funder is asking for. And sometimes they can even go as far as going back to the funder on your behalf and saying, okay, you say you want X, but that doesn't make any sense. Do you really want Y? And oftentimes, particularly inexperienced or newer funders will be like, yeah, that's actually what I want. You say you want a list of expenditures, but I think what you want is a budget. And budgets aren't just a list of expenditures, it's also a list of income. Is that what you want? And they'd be like, yeah, of course that's what I want. Well, then you should say that. But I'll make sure that that's what's provided. But yeah, it can be very detailed at times. And if you miss those items, sometimes the funder has wiggle room to say, hey, you missed, attachment B, please send it along. And other times that they just use that as a defining criteria and say, you missed attachment B, we're going to move on to the other 73 applications that did get attachment B and drop you.
Right. So what about, are you able to write grants for staffing, purchasing property, fixing property? What does that look like? What are you limited to in the grant process?
So you are limited in the grant writing to whatever the funder is willing to fund. Now, typically, they're less excited about funding things like staffing and operational costs. And they are more excited about funding things like buying things, fixing things, acquiring things, stuff that they can come and look at. Typically gets them more excited than just generalized operating costs.
Okay, but the operational costs are not impossible because right? Because I think that there are some nonprofits in the Viroqua area that use quite a bit of grant money for operations.
Yep, they're not impossible. They're typically better if you can attach it to a specific project. Sometimes you'll find a funder who just has a soft spot for one specific area, and they love to fund operational costs. So you might find either a donor or a foundation that really loves fish and fish habitat, and you run a nonprofit that focuses on repairing and establishing fish habitat. And so they're going to love to pay those costs, and they don't care if it's a project or if it's operations. They doesn't matter to them.
Yeah.
Other foundations where you're trying to kind of fit yourself into. So, for example, Cabela's has a foundation, and if you're a fish habitat nonprofit, you're going to fit in their wheelhouse, but they're not going to want to fund ongoing operations because they don't want to become every year they give you money. So instead with them, if you want staffing costs, you're going to go to them and be like, well, here's this very special fish habitat creation project we have going on. And, if you fund this, some amount of your funding that you give us is going to go to pay these staffing costs. Now it's only those costs will only happen during the period of the project, but if it's a 2 or 3 year project, you can get 2 or 3 years of staffing costs worked out the funding that way.
Okay, sure. So what are the steps then if somebody is ready to begin putting together a grant or ready to hire a grant writer? What are the steps that that business or entity would need to take to begin that process?
So the first step is really having a vision of what you want to accomplish. And so sometimes that vision includes knowing where you want to take your application, like to what funder, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just, this is what we want to accomplish. And then you can start hunting for funding sources. If you're engaging a grant writer, they can also help you find those funding sources. Sometimes they know of funding sources or funders, and they also have access to databases and other sources where they can kind of help you find targets that might want to entertain what it is you want funded.
Right.
The next step is really reaching out and establishing some sort of relationship. This doesn't mean you have to be best friends with the funder, but rarely should an application come in cold where the funder is like, I have never heard of ABC nonprofit. Whether it's pick up a phone and have a conversation with a grants officer or with a government staff person and just be like, hey, I saw this grant. Here's an idea we have. Do you think it would fit within your wheelhouse? Even if you read their grant materials and be like, yeah, our project absolutely fits within their wheelhouse. Just pick up a phone and ask them, because that will, at least they will tell you yes or no. And then when they see your application come in, they're like, oh yeah, that's right. We talked about this. Now, particularly with private foundations, the more relationship you can have, the better. Government, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. The private foundation, if you can have an actual relationship with that grants officer, like they know your name, doesn't mean you have to have dinner with them every month, but they know who you are. They've toured your agency. They've seen your work. That's going to be super helpful in getting your grant consent. Once you've kind of established your vision, you've established where you're going to go for money, then it's really, you either start working through the grant application, or you engage a grant writer and they'll start working through the grant application. And it's really going to be 2 tracks. One is going to be sort of the creative process of coming up with a great story and then finding the statistics that support that story. The other side, or the other track, parallel track, is going to be finding all the stuff they need, the IRS letters and the state registrations and the certificates and all the board listings and all that supportive documentation that most funders want to see, and you're going to put that together. The good news is, once you've put that stuff together once, you generally have it available for future grants, because almost every funder wants to see your 501c3 letter. Everyone wants to see your list of your board of directors. Everyone wants to see your articles. Everyone wants to see your bylaws. So once you get those basic things together, you usually don't have to do it every time, but you do have to make sure you go back and update them. You don't want to. I once sent in an application where we were able to amend it, but we sent it in and then we realized, 2 board members had passed away and nobody in the agency had updated the board member list.
Yeah, that's a little problematic, right?
Problematic, I mean, would the funder have ever figured it out? I don't know, but we did, so we were able to go back and edit it. But it's just problematic to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and dark. I think it really casts a pall on a grant that's sitting with the application when you have members who are deceased on it. Todd,
Yes, yes.
I have a question about the creativity and ideas of these grants, right? Like, I think as a small business owner, to walk you through the process, I know that when I was first looking for funding and okay, how do I make this work? Well, there's grants out there. Yeah, that's a good idea. I should like see about applying for some grants. From your perspective, is the creativity and the idea of the grant and the actual business more important, or is the better part of the process to make sure that the grant is absolutely accurate in the application and following the directions of that grant? Do you have an insight on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, it's a little bit of both. So you have to realize that what you say you're going to do in the grant is what the expectation is you will do. Can that be amended? Sure. Can it be altered after the grant is funded? Sure. Does that put you at risk? Yes, because you can decide that, well, we can't, we said we're going to do X and we can't do it all. So we're going to do less. But then you risk the funder coming back and saying, well, then we're going to give you less money, or we'd like our money back. And that's a challenging situation. However, the creativity is super important. You need an idea that's going to get your funder excited. And funders, for the most part, don't want to fund the same old thing every time. I will say there is one probably big challenge in the sort of grant world today that we find ourselves in, which is, well, it's actually a dual-sided challenge. The first is probably from about 10 years ago onward, every funder, it seems, or many funders, want to fund the next great idea. And that's awesome, except the next great idea isn't always proven, whereas sometimes we have some really great solutions that work. They just need money. But they aren't the cool, sexy thing, so it's hard to get them funded. The other piece is every funder these days is looking for your sustainability plan. What's the plan that when their money goes away, your project is going to continue to happen? And particularly in the nonprofit sector, that's a challenge because the answer is oftentimes, that's literally why you guys exist. That's why funders exist. You give us money and we do the work. And the question you're asking me is, well, when we stop giving you money, how will you continue to do the work? And oftentimes the answer is, we just won't do it anymore. That's the answer. Or I'll go find a new funder. Funders usually don't like that. So, if people were willing to pay for some of this stuff to happen, you wouldn't need nonprofits to do it. From a for-profit business side, the creativity is pretty important, though it is awfully hard to find grants for-profit businesses. Mainly because if a for-profit business idea is strong enough, it should be able to attract capital to support it on its own without, having to get free money. That said, there are oftentimes, or I shouldn't say often, there are sometimes the ability to tap low-interest loans or pretty flexible or creative loan structures from places like Rural Development or the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And while those aren't grants, they are, a loan at 2% that doesn't have to be paid back for 3 years is certainly a better opportunity than a loan at 8% that kicks in the day you open your business doors.
Yeah. That's a great point. That being said, what does it cost to hire a guy like you? Is a grant writer. Like, do you work on percentages of the grant? Is there some like you take a cut? Obviously, you are doing this as your profession. So, what does that look like?
So it's an excellent question. And so one thing everyone should automatically know is if you engage a grant funder and they want a percentage of the grant, walk away. The National Association of Grant Writers, their standard guidelines and their members have to commit to not taking a percentage of the grant, mainly because honestly, the amount of work it takes to write a $10,000 grant is not dramatically different than the work it takes to write a $100,000 grant. And so if you're getting 2% of a $100,000 grant and you get overpaid pretty quickly. And I will tell you, from having done this for a long time, there is a inverse proportion of the amount of work it takes versus the amount of money you get. And so, the example I always use is when I would go for $5,000 grants from local foundations, it would be a 6-page application that would take me hours. And then I would turn around and ask the state for $4 million for weatherization. And I literally filled out one spreadsheet that took me 30 minutes and sent it in. Because I don't know why, but that's just how this is. So when you're engaging a grant writer, what you want to do is they should have a sense of how much it's going to cost to put together the project. I will say most grant writers are going to have how much it's going to cost to put together the project. I will say